We begin our program tonight with breaking news and a CBC exclusive. Last night we heard from former Supreme Court Justice Louise Arbour and former Justice Minister Alan Rock. They're urging the federal government to end the extradition hearing for Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. We've learned tonight, though, they're not alone. In fact, nearly 20 prominent political voices in this country have signed their name to a letter delivered to the Prime Minister just yesterday, asking him to consider ending Meng's extradition in order to bring Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor home. David Cochran has been following the details of this story. He joins us now to break it down. Hey, David. So let's start off with the names on this letter.
Yeah, this is a letter that our hustling producer, Brendan McDonald, obtained for the PMP team. And it's signed by 19 people, including Louise Arbour and Alan Rock, who were on the show last night. But they're joined by this cross-section of people like Lloyd Axworthy, former Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Liberals, Ed Broadbent, former NDP leader, Derek Burney, former ambassador to the U.S., Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister Mulroney, Lawrence Cannon, a conservative of Foreign Affairs Minister, Robert Fowler, a former diplomat and a former hostage kidnapped and held in Africa by a terrorist group for a period of time, Hugh Segal, the former chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs, a member of the Senate now, a conservative by political affiliation. So what you've got is a letter signed by a cross-section of all parties, diplomats and politicians, and even a former journalist, Don Newman, our old colleague who hosted the predecessor to this show for the CBC. His name is also on the list of names of people very familiar to people who watch Power and Politics.
For sure. And let's go through, they certainly jumped out at me as soon as I saw that letter. Let's go through what the letter says. First on the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, both of whom have been detained in China now for more than 560 days.
Yeah, so the letter opens with this very human argument about the health and well-being of the two Michaels, writing that we believe the two Michaels will remain in their Chinese prison cells until Meng is free to return to China. And then it outlines how long that could be, because the Meng case is dragging on. There have been challenges to the extradition and to the arrest itself. So they point out that it could be 2024 before the whole question of extradition is even settled. And then if she loses, she goes to the U.S. for trial, and fraud cases are complex. They take a long period of time. So they argue that this will go on for an extended period of years. All the while, the Michaels are kept in these inhumane conditions in 10 by 10 cells, no fresh air, no outside access, charged in a justice system with a 99% conviction rate, and being held in Beijing right now where there are reports of a resurgence of coronavirus. So they write that it is not an exaggeration to say that their lives are at grave risk. So in the letter, Vashi, they point to the legal opinion prepared by Brian Greenspan, which says the government can release Meng, and they argue the government should release Meng.
And that is, in fact, what Louise Arbour and Alan Rock were arguing yesterday. We just didn't know that all these additional names were supportive of that argument. They also zone in on foreign policy concerns. What do they say there?
Right. So they argue that this entire episode, this entire controversy is undermining the government's ability to defend and promote Canada's interests. And I want to show you a specific quote from the letter. They write, in short, Canada's foreign policy is also being held hostage. Ending the Meng extradition process now and securing the release of the two Michaels would untie Canada's hands at a time when the Canadian government must be fully free to redefine its strategic approach to China and take the tough steps needed to protect and advance our own interests. And they then go on to list the issues compromised by this. Huawei and 5G, China's policy towards Hong Kong, China's human rights abuses domestically, and the way they see it is that the risk to the two Michaels holds Canada back on all of these issues. Now, they acknowledge a downside here. This is going to upset the U.S., but they argue that has happened before. Canada staying out of the Iraq War, the relationship was strong enough for that to rebound, and basically the Americans could get over it. They say Canadians will probably be broadly supportive of this, especially given that President Trump has linked trade to Meng Wanzhou. But then there's also the issue of hostage diplomacy, Vashi. I mean, they don't argue that yielding to bullying and blackmail is ideal, only that it may be necessary, and that even holding firm and standing up to China, it's no guarantee that they won't snatch and detain even more people or even escalate this by grabbing more than just two people if Meng Wanzhou isn't free.
So let's talk a bit about the implications of this for the federal government. And on that note, just 2 minutes ago, we got a statement from the Minister of Justice's office on the subject. I'm going to read a portion of it. I think it's pretty much the same one that it is. Okay,
pretty much, yeah.
This is exactly the statement that we got last night after the initial comments from Ms. Arbour and Mr. Rock. It basically says, with respect to the extradition process in Canada, extraditions are conducted in conformity with the Extradition Act, et cetera, et cetera. Our process ensures that individual rights are protected and that those sought for extradition are afforded due process before the courts while honoring our international treaty obligations. We are well aware of the laws and processes governing this important regime. So that's a portion of what the feds say in response to this letter.
Right.
What are the implications for them?
So obviously no sign that the Trudeau government is flinching on this. They are standing by their lines and standing by their position. And look, the argument is if you release Meng Wanzhou, the two Michaels get released. There's a lot of assumption and a lot of risk in that because there's absolutely no guarantee that that would happen. But this all adds to a growing list of credible voices calling on the government to act either by releasing Meng or by taking tougher action. We've heard calls for sanctions, revoking student visas, taking China to international courts. So this ups the internal pressure on the government to act. What's interesting, I think, is how China reacts. We saw this week the foreign ministry spokesperson in Beijing directly referencing the interviews that Michael Kovrig wife gave to our colleague Adrienne Arsenault and the very specific arguments in the legal opinion prepared by Brian Greenspun. So they're clearly paying attention. I suspect they will pay attention to this, and it's even likely they may cite this as further proof that Canada should release Meng Wanzhou.
I suspect you're right. Thanks, David. Appreciate all that information. The CBC's David Cochrane. So should the federal government listen to this call? What kind of message will that send to China? David Mulroney served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2009 to 2012. He's now a distinguished fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and joins us from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Mulroney. Good to see you as always.
Good to see you, Vashi.
What is your reaction to this letter?
Well, one of the things that surprised me about the letter, and as you say, it's a blue chip list of foreign policy and senior people in government, foreign policy experts, senior people in government. It's not, though, all that strong in terms of China expertise, and that's the flaw in the letter. It doesn't really attempt to understand what China is doing, how it works, and how it's likely to react to all of this. And the reality is that China is getting more aggressive, not less, and that it doubles down on any technique that it finds to have worked. And we can expect it to double down on hostage diplomacy if, in fact, we are seen to acquiesce. So the notion that somehow this would free us to speak honestly on foreign policy and to recover our integrity on foreign policy, I think is flawed. And if anything, we would see China stepping up efforts to punish countries like Canada. It's also true that in our own future, we're going to have to get a lot tougher on Chinese interference in Canada. So we will face more rather than fewer instances where we have to find the courage to be tough. The other thing that I think is kind of unfortunate in all of this is the notion that if we just give in this time, China will, all will be fine. China will down tools, and we can get back to the foreign policy that we used to have. The reality is that the government wasn't particularly tough on China before the Michaels were detained, kidnapped, in effect, by the Chinese government. And that allowing this court process to go forward is the most courageous thing the government has done. So it's quite bizarre to argue that if the government backs down on this, it can find its mojo later on. Nobody, myself included, wants to see the Michaels in detention a day longer than they have to be, and our hearts go out to them. But I don't think that the step that's being suggested, is in the national interest, particularly if we look at where China's going and how it's likely to treat Canada in the future, regardless of what we do.
I have to ask you about some of the names on the list. There is quite a cross-section of political affiliation represented. You have everyone from Ed Broadbent to Derek Burney. What does that say to you?
Well, again, it's an impressive list, and people I have. Derek Burney has been a boss and mentor to me, and I have great respect for him. But I think in this case, the call that they're making is the wrong call, and it comes at a time when we need our resolve. We're going into a future with China and China in the world, and increasingly powerful and aggressive China, where we may look back at this and say this was a relatively easy test that was put to us. It may involve more people. One of the things that I see China doing if we acquiesce to hostage diplomacy is upping the ante and seeking to have Canada repatriate people in Canada to China that are on their wanted list. They could be Uyghur Canadians or Uyghurs or Tibetans or dual nationals. China is quite capable of doing all of these things. So you have to take a really hard look at what China is like and how it operates. The other thing that I think it comes across in the letter, and it's an unfortunate gap or lapse, is the notion that somehow we can get back to a risk-free, cost-free future. I'm not suggesting that the way ahead is going to be easy for us or easy for the families or the two detained Canadians if we stay the course, but it's what we must do and what we should do. But the future, a more China-centric world, will be even more difficult for us. And rather than figuring out how we can evade our responsibilities here, it's much more important for this blue chip group and others to think about how Canada can prepare for that world and ready itself for some of the costs and risks that we're going to have to face.
My colleague David raised the prospect or the idea of how China might interpret this and how this will be received in that country. How do you think it will be?
I think every time something like this happens, China is encouraged to believe that its pressure is working, and it will continue to stay the course. So, by now, the list of very senior people and people with very close links to the government, and a few opposition people as well, is very impressive. And I think it would give the Chinese a reason to hope that this will work. The other thing that I found strange about the letter, but it's almost necessary to make the point that it makes, is that it, to a certain extent, trivializes the case against Meng Wanzhou. It takes a kind of Chinese perspective on the case, and it almost is as if that, the President Trump is mentioned for some of the unfortunate things he said, but it's almost as if this was, written on the back of an envelope by some Trump staffer, as opposed to being an indictment brought against Ms. Meng by the Federal Court of the Eastern District of New York. If you read the indictment, it's actually quite compelling. And if you follow what's happened in the extradition case so far, you would be encouraged to believe that there is a serious case being heard here according to our legal system. This used to be the kind of thing that Canadians took seriously. We accepted it as part of our responsibility in the world that there is a functioning extradition system so that people can't evade justice by crossing a border. So this isn't we're not simply caught between China, Xi Jinping, and President Trump. We're being asked to bear part of the burden that comes with being a responsible country. We used to be a responsible country, and we've got to continue to be responsible.
I interviewed Louise Arbour and Alan Rock, two of the signatories to this letter, last night, who both put forth, and especially Ms. Arbour, the argument, and it goes to the crux of what you were just talking about, that it should never have happened in the first place, that essentially there isn't necessarily dual criminality because, even though a BC judge has ruled otherwise, because the set of charges, the idea of the sanctions as they existed in the U.S. are so informed by the president, and they didn't exist here at the same time. They make the point in the letter that they feel like Canadians are supportive of that viewpoint. What would you say in response to that?
My sense is that as Canadians have followed the case, they have come to the view that there is something that's worth looking at. We do have an interest in seeing that justice is done in our jurisdiction and in other jurisdictions. So I fundamentally disagree with that, although I certainly acknowledge that the president's statements early on were of no help. But it's a serious case that's being brought. It's also important, when we talk about Huawei and the decision that we make, it's one that Canadians should be paying attention to as we learn about how Huawei has operated in other jurisdictions. This is an important opportunity for Canadians to inform themselves.
Before I let you go, Mr. Mulroney, as David characterized it, there is a real human element to the beginning of this letter, and certainly we have heard on this network too from Michael Kovrig's wife. There is a real human element to what is a live foreign policy issue as well, and that is the detainment of these two gentlemen, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. I wonder, I sort of see it as the driving factor, why we're hearing about this now, why people are asking the government to take this under consideration. And I understand all the arguments that you've put forth, but are you sympathetic to that human side of this?
I find it heartbreaking. I never met either of the Michaels, but I have met Vina, Michael Kovrig's wife, and I would want nothing more than his freedom. But the reality is that what's being proposed, I think, is something that's not in our national interest. Where I wish this discussion was going, and where I wish all of these distinguished Canadians were spending more time, is on thinking about how we make Canadians safer in the world. We're still, things have ceased because of the pandemic, but the government very quickly got back to encouraging people to go to China, pumping visits and exchanges. We should be thinking very seriously about the kind of risk we're building up there. China does detain people and use them as pawns, and our options are very, very limited. So we can't, we're sort of have an irreconcilable difference where we accept this, and at the same time we're increasing our risk by pretending that China is a normal country when it comes to visits and exchanges. We should be thinking very hard about this so it doesn't happen to other people, because it's wrong and it's heartbreaking.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Mulroney. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you, Vashi. So it's quite bizarre to argue that if the government backs down on this, it can find its mojo later on. Nobody, myself included, wants to see the Michaels in detention a day longer than they have to be, and our hearts go out to them. But I don't think that this step, the step that's being suggested, is in the national interest, particularly if we look at where China's going and how it's likely to treat Canada in the future, regardless of what we do.
That was David Mulroney, a former Canadian ambassador to China, speaking a bit earlier on the show. He's referring to a letter signed by several high-profile political voices. That letter is to the Prime Minister, asking that he put an end to the extradition process underway in the Meng Wanzhou case. They say doing so would help free Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, two Canadians who have been detained in China now for more than 560 days. Now, the group of signatories includes Alan Rock, Lawrence Cannon, Ed Broadbent, Louise Arbour, Hugh Segal, and Robert Fowler. They run the full gamut of the political spectrum, as you can hear, and that just names a handful of them. How much sway might they have with the current government, and could this give China a leg up in the dispute, as Mr. Mulroney contends? Time for the Power Panel to weigh in on those questions. In Montreal, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister David Hertel of Fasken. Summa Strategies' Tim Powers is with us in Ottawa, as is Kiavash Najavi, Director of Policy and Communications at PIPS and former aide to the late NDP MP Paul Dewar. Hi, all three of you. Great to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be here.
Hello.
Let's get right into it. Tim, I want to start with you because as I look through those names, there were a couple of people, particular friends of the show, like Derek Burney and Lawrence Cannon, who really jumped out at me because a key to the conservative critique of the Liberal government has been its foreign policy toward China. So my jaw kind of dropped when they signed a letter that expressly advises this government to drop the extradition proceedings and kind of in a way, I'm not saying they say it in this way, but kind of in a way give in to China.
Yeah, look, there's some well-credentialed people. You've named two of them. And of course, Mr. Burney was also the Canadian ambassador to Washington, so he understands geopolitics to be well. There's nothing to suggest this, Vashi, but I do wonder if some in the government were looking for more public pressure to help not necessarily drive action with China, but the United States, because I don't think the right thing for Canada to do politically, never mind the abandonment of its respective extradition treaties, would be to drop this. I'm with Mr. Mulroney on that. But if the United States decided to drop its charges against Meng Wanzhou, then the game changes significantly. So I don't know if there's some angle in there. There's nothing to suggest Mr. Trump is going to do that. Again, the Chinese government is probably very happy, as your intro asked us to consider, to have these prominent Canadians putting some pressure on the Trudeau government to end the extradition process.
On the flip side, Kiavash, they put forward some pretty compelling arguments, and chief among them, the human side of all this. We mentioned off the top that Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig have both been detained now for more than 560 days. There is a huge concern that given the current climate in the world, as well as the pandemic, that this could go on for a very long time, not to mention they were charged last Friday, 99% conviction rate in China based on the evidence in front of us. Certainly that underpins the argument that they're making.
Absolutely. Nobody wants to see Canadian justice process undermined in the process of basically what is hostage negotiation with a state actor. But we have to also take into consideration that wishful thinking is not a plan. The individuals are in distress. Their families are suffering from the situation. And unless there's another option on the table that has not been produced by anybody else, including the Prime Minister, we should be taking advantage of the option that currently exists. Saving the lives of Canadian citizens should be paramount.
What is the option? Let me quickly follow up with you. What is the option that currently exists, though?
Well, the option that exists is what these individuals have put forward. These prominent Canadians have suggested to the Prime Minister. The authority exists based on the legal opinion of that has been released recently, that the Justice Minister could take action and stop the process so that we can basically do an exchange with China. It's an awful situation. I don't envy any government that has to make this decision, but I think we have to also focus our mind on the well-being of these Canadians. Unless there's another option that the Prime Minister has in his pocket and has not exercised, this seems to be the only option in front of us right now, if we think saving the lives of citizens is the most important thing to do.
I mean, it's such a complex set of considerations because no one would ever take away, David, from how precarious the situation is for the two Michaels. And I can't even imagine what it's like to be their family. I listened to Adrienne Arsenault's interview with Mr. Kovrig wife, and I'm sure, like many Canadians, it was heartbreaking to hear what that family is going through right now. At the same time, as Mr. Mulroney points out, what happens if you do it this one time? The next time China wants to see some sort of outcome here in Canada and they decide to take another two Canadians essentially hostage. I mean, there is that to consider too.
There is, and I, just like you and everybody, I think in Canada, our hearts go out to both Michaels, their families, and if it were my brother or my father being in this situation, I would be completely distraught. Now, the situation, though, is much more complex, and we can't look at this issue just in a silo. The Prime Minister and the government, since 2018, has been very steadfast in saying we have to respect our justice system and the legal process. Now, while this letter is very impressive in terms of the signatories, this does not change the fact that there is a Canadian legal process in place right now, and we have to go through that process. Granted, the Justice Minister, can put a stop to the proceedings, but the Prime Minister, and rightly so, has to consider all the elements. The U.S. reaction. We have a president in the United States right now we know can react on a dime and impose all kinds of economic sanctions. What we have to look at, do we have any guarantees right now the Chinese government would automatically free the two Michaels if these proceedings were stopped? We don't know this. There might be other strings attached regarding 5G, for example, regarding our position regarding Hong Kong, regarding our position regarding human rights. We have to look at the whole board here and make sure we don't trade away one of our fundamental values, which is respecting our institutions right now. And so I think what opportunity there is right now for the government and for the Prime Minister and Minister Champagne is to set forth maybe a really concrete new policy regarding China, regarding all aspects, the Chinese investments here, our trade relationship with China, and put forth a whole set of different measures and show more action than what we've seen previously. It's
interesting, and it's not in the same vein, but certainly the same point is made in the letter, Tim. Quite apart from our concern about the two Michaels, they write, it seems to us that Meng Wanzhou extradition proceeding is making it impossible for your government to define and pursue an effective foreign policy toward China.
Indeed, that may be true, and David's articulated some of what should happen. But I go back to something else Mr. Mulroney said to you, Vashi. I mean, and he's a diplomat and I'm not, so I'll use a word he didn't. China is behaving like a thug. There is no guarantee that China would even respond to this. And why would we want to reward their thuggery-like behavior, even as we've all agreed how concerned we are about the two Michaels, their family, and everything that they're going through? There is no sense that this would work. And even if the Trudeau government took this action, what is it going to cost us with the Chinese? I mean, again, let's be real here, right? We're still dealing with COVID. The Chinese have a lot of pressure they're able to exert on us because where do most of our supplies of PPE come from? They come from China. We're not going to have the domestic capacity to offset that for a couple of years. This really is a tough one, and the Chinese haven't demonstrated any inclination for in terms of what they want from our behavior other than total capitulation. And would be giving the Michaels back be the capitulation that they want, or giving us having the government release the extradition process with Meng Wanzhou enough to certify that capitulation?
I have just 30 seconds left for a comment from each of you, Kiavash and David, so I'll ask you the same question. Do you think the names on this list will at all affect the calculation for the government, or at all impact, I guess, how they assess what they decide to do going forward? Kiavash, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think definitely the caliber of people there. I mean, we're talking about maintaining the consistency of our judicial system. If Louise Arbour is telling us that it's okay to rethink that priority, yes, that gives some space for the government to try to be more creative. Just want to go back, the old adage of we don't negotiate with terrorists is great public policy and great public posturing, but the fact is that we always negotiate with thugs and terrorists. That is what we do. That is what we need to do in order to survive in this day and age, and be able to find spaces where our citizens are protected. I think, all the theoretical questions and all the very important issues that the other panelists have put forward are really important to think through, and I don't envy the government having to think through it, but we have to think about the well-being of our citizens. That's first and foremost for me.
David, last word to you.
It opens the door, I think, for the government to be more aggressive. Yes, this list is impressive. It's going to force a response from the government. But I think it cannot mean a complete reversal of the policy that's been put in place since the beginning of this ordeal. But at the same time, that means also that the federal government, the Prime Minister, Minister Champagne, can put forth new elements of foreign policy, looking into the future, not just look at this piece in a silo.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much to our power panel tonight for a great discussion. Thanks to David Ertel, Tim Powers, and Kiavash Najavi. I want to bring in now someone who added their name to the list of signatories on this letter, Hugh Segal. He's a former Conservative senator. He also served as chief of staff, to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. And as he's listed on the letter, Mr. Segal is also the former chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Relations. Hi, Mr. Segal. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks very much for making time. My first question is a simple one. Why did you sign this letter?
I signed the letter really for two reasons. Firstly, because I was offended that a very detailed legal opinion on the authority that the minister has under the extradition laws on this matter, prepared by an outstanding practitioner by the name of Brian Greenspan, criminal practitioner, was submitted by the spouse of one of the Chinese prisoners of a month and a half or so ago, and there had been no response from the Department of Justice. I thought that was arrogant and insensitive and inhumane. Second reason I signed it is because it is perfectly clear that whatever the legal transmission of the request for extradition was, the United States head of state, duly elected, Mr. Trump, however people may feel about his various different views, made it perfectly clear that he was prepared to trade the extradition matter with respect to Meng Wanzhou in return for a better trade deal. So that made it perfectly clear to me that there should be a discussion in government and in Parliament and in the Department of Justice whether the existing rights that exist for the minister under the law, a law that was passed many years ago, should be exercised in the interest of the broad global Canadian economic and social interests, but also most importantly in terms of the humanitarian interests of the two Canadians being held illegally as hostages in China. And the notion that there would be no discussion of this, that would all just be dismissed because there's an opinion in the Department of Justice that no one wants to actually explain, strikes me as the height of arrogance and really not appropriate in a circumstance where human lives are very much at stake.
I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you, Mr. Segal. It's a bit echoey, so I apologize to our audience. I think I understood everything you said, so I want to follow up, and hopefully the sound gets a little bit better because it is important to share your perspective tonight on the program. I take your point on the legal opinion that was offered and whether, the government should be considering that or entertaining it as one of the options it has. But the letter goes further than just saying this should be an option the government considers. it actually says the government should take this option. And the government has said all along that they shouldn't because, in effect, it's capitulating to hostage diplomacy. What is your response to that?
Well, the government's position has been clear, and I don't question either the integrity or the intent of the government, but I think we have to look at the world the way it is. I don't have a strong sense of support or interest in the kind of wolf diplomacy that is being used by the Chinese in a host of different areas with our Indian Commonwealth allies and in the South China Sea, in a host of other areas of interaction. But this issue is a narrow issue that relates to two Canadians who are being held in prison having done nothing wrong, having committed no crime. And I think the minister owes it to Canada, and he owes it to the families of the people involved to actually engage on this issue and give serious thought to why one might not bring this proceeding to an end. Madam Justice Holmes, who is the presiding judge in the court case, has said she's concerned about how long this is taking. I thought that was a very strong signal from an independent member of the judiciary about the process. The COVID circumstance has probably extended how long this process is going to be running, and every single day that we know this is going on is probably like a month or two in the lives of the two Canadians being held unjustly in China. So when the government has instruments by which it can make a decision that makes circumstances better and more humane, I think it has a duty to give it serious consideration and to act upon it, and that's what the letter calls for.
What if that decision is taken and the circumstances don't get better? And by that I mean, what if they make the decision to end the extradition of Meng Wanzhou, but China does not release Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor?
Well, I think in any kind of equation about what a government might do, the issue is not what happens if we do nothing and they do nothing. The issue is what might we do so they might do something. That's the question that has to be addressed. And if there is something that we might do, which might produce a better result, the notion of setting that aside strikes me as a little bit inhumane and quite insensitive.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. But Mr. Segal, I really appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.